The night over the English Channel feels almost unreal in its stillness, as if the world itself is holding its breath. And inside a reinforced concrete bunker carved into the bluffs above Omaha Beach, a young German machine gunner runs an oiled cloth along the barrel of his weapon with slow, deliberate care, listening to the distant rhythm of waves that give no hint of what is coming. Heinrich So has done this routine countless times before, the mechanical ritual of maintenance grounding him in a war that has already stretched far beyond anything he imagined when he first put on the uniform. And in his pocket rests a letter from a girl far away who still believes in a future untouched by the violence closing in around him. Just 3 days earlier, he had written back with quiet confidence, repeating what every soldier along the Atlantic Wall had been told, that any invasion would be crushed within hours, that the sea itself would become a grave for those who dared attempt it. Above him, the concrete feels immovable and eternal, part of a defensive system that stretches across an entire continent, a wall of steel and stone that Adolf Hitler himself had declared impenetrable. And when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had inspected these positions, he had nodded with satisfaction, studying the overlapping arcs of fire and the carefully placed obstacles designed to tear apart any landing force before it could even reach the sand. The message had been clear and repeated endlessly, that the enemy would never break through, that the war in the West would be decided here in a single, decisive failure for the Allies. Yet as So peers out into the darkness, he sees nothing but empty sea and silent sky. And the calm is so complete that it almost feels like a deception in itself, a quiet before something too large to comprehend. In just a few hours, that same horizon will be filled with more ships than any soldier in history has ever witnessed, and the beliefs that sustained him through years of war will begin to collapse under the weight of reality. Because what happens on June 6, 1944, will not simply be a battle for a stretch of French coastline, but a moment when two completely different visions of warfare collide, one built on discipline and defensive preparation, the other on overwhelming industrial power and coordination on a scale never seen before. And as the first reports begin to filter through the German command structure in the early hours of that morning, confusion spreading faster than clarity, one question will quietly emerge beneath the chaos. A question that few dare to speak aloud, but many begin to feel with growing certainty. What if the Atlantic Wall is not enough? The first signs come not from the sea, but from the sky, as radar operators along the Normandy coast detect formations moving through the darkness, signals that at first seem routine because deception raids have become a familiar pattern, designed to keep German forces constantly on edge, and so the initial response is cautious but not alarmed. Yet as minutes pass, the reports multiply and begin to contradict each other, describing parachutes drifting down across fields and villages far inland, some to the east, others to the west, scattered in a way that makes no immediate sense. Officers receiving these messages struggle to piece together a coherent picture because the information does not align with any expected pattern of attack, and the presence of dummy paratroopers equipped with small explosive devices only deepens the confusion, creating the illusion of a far larger and more chaotic airborne assault than is actually taking place. Units report contact with enemy troops but cannot determine their strength or purpose, and as isolated skirmishes break out across the countryside, the larger reality remains obscured behind a fog of uncertainty. For Major Hans von Luck, a commander within the 21st Panzer Division, the implications are clear almost immediately, because airborne troops appearing behind the lines can only mean one thing: that a larger operation is imminent, that the coastline itself is about to become the focal point of a massive assault. He requests permission to move his forces, to strike before the enemy can consolidate. But the response he receives reflects a deeper problem within the German command system, a hesitation rooted in rigid hierarchy and the fear of acting without explicit orders. He is told to wait, and in that waiting, something critical begins to slip away, because every minute that passes allows the scattered airborne units to regroup, to secure key positions, to prepare the ground for what is coming next, and the opportunity to disrupt the invasion before it fully unfolds quietly disappears. As the first light of dawn begins to creep over the horizon, the scale of the situation reveals itself in a way that no report or calculation could have prepared them for, because what emerges from the morning haze is not a conventional naval force, but something far beyond it. A vast expanse of ships stretching from one end of the visible sea to the other, so numerous that they seem to merge into a single continuous mass. Observers along the coast struggle to process what they are seeing. their training offering no framework for a fleet of this magnitude. And for a moment, the sheer size of it creates a kind of disbelief, as if the mind refuses to accept the evidence presented before the eyes. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft, transport vessels, all moving with deliberate purpose toward the shore, forming a coordinated advance that speaks not just of military strength, but of industrial capacity on a scale that dwarfs anything Germany can bring to bear. The realization spreads quickly among the defenders that this is not a probing attack or a diversion, but the main effort itself. The long-anticipated invasion that has been discussed and prepared for over years, now unfolding in a single overwhelming display of force. Then the bombardment begins. The sound arrives first as a distant thunder that builds rapidly into a continuous roar as naval guns unleash a barrage of shells that tear into the coastline with devastating precision, and the carefully constructed defenses that were meant to withstand any assault are suddenly subjected to a level of firepower that exceeds all prior experience. Concrete cracks under the impact, earth is thrown into the air in massive plumes, and the psychological effect is immediate and profound. As soldiers who had believed themselves secure within their fortifications now find those same structures trembling and collapsing around them. Inside his bunker, So grips his machine gun and waits, the vibrations from the explosions traveling through the walls and into his body, a constant reminder that the battle has already begun, even before he has fired a single shot. The carefully calculated fields of fire remain unchanged, the geometry of defense still intact, but the certainty that once accompanied those preparations has begun to erode under the relentless pressure of the bombardment. Across the German positions, similar scenes unfold, men scrambling to maintain communication, to assess damage, to prepare for the inevitable moment when the enemy reaches the shore. And yet, even as they do so, another realization begins to take shape, one that cuts deeper than the physical destruction around them. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German dominance in the air, is almost entirely absent. There are no waves of fighters sweeping in to challenge the Allied aircraft. No coordinated counterattack from above, and when a small number of German planes finally appear, their presence feels almost symbolic, a gesture rather than a meaningful attempt to influence the battle. The imbalance is so stark that it reinforces the growing sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the assumptions underlying the entire defense of the Atlantic Wall may no longer hold true. By the time the first landing craft approach the beaches, the bombardment has eased just enough to reveal the next phase of the assault, and So adjusts his position, bringing the sights of his MG-42 into alignment with the waterline, his training taking over even as his mind struggles to reconcile the scale of what he has witnessed. The ramps drop and soldiers begin to move forward into the surf, and in that moment the abstract concept of invasion becomes immediate and tangible, a line of advancing figures crossing the open ground between sea and shore. He opens fire. The weapon responds with a rapid, controlled burst, the recoil steady and familiar, and for a brief period the world narrows to a single task: to engage targets as they appear, to apply the discipline drilled into him over months of preparation. Around him, other guns join in, creating overlapping zones of fire that cut into the advancing waves, and the initial effect is, exactly as the defensive plans had predicted, heavy casualties inflicted on the attackers as they struggle to move through the obstacles and across the exposed sand. Yet even in those first moments, something is different. Because where one group falls, another follows, and where a landing craft is destroyed, two more take its place. And the flow of men and equipment does not diminish, but continues with a persistence that begins to defy expectation. The calculations that had underpinned the defense assumed a finite assault, a force that could be broken and repelled through concentrated firepower. But what unfolds instead is a continuous stream, a sustained effort that does not appear to weaken under losses. Time begins to blur as the battle intensifies, the noise of gunfire and explosions blending into a constant background that leaves little room for reflection. And So continues to fire, reloading, adjusting, firing again, his focus locked on the immediate task even as the larger picture grows increasingly difficult to comprehend. The heat from the weapon builds steadily, the barrel nearing its limits, and the spent casings accumulate around him in growing piles that mark the passage of hours. Reports from other positions begin to filter in, fragmented and often incomplete, describing similar experiences along the line. Heavy fighting, mounting casualties, and a growing sense that the scale of the attack is beyond anything they had prepared for. Ammunition, carefully rationed for what was expected to be a prolonged but manageable engagement, begins to run low at an alarming rate, and attempts to resupply are hindered by the constant presence of Allied aircraft that dominate the skies. As the morning turns into afternoon, the situation becomes increasingly untenable, not because the defenders lack the will to fight, but because the conditions under which they are fighting have fundamentally changed, and the balance of power is shifting in a way that cannot be corrected through individual effort or localized success. So continues to fire, the rhythm of the machine gun now almost automatic, his body responding to the demands of the moment even as exhaustion begins to set in. And somewhere beyond the immediate chaos, a realization starts to take hold, slow and unwelcome, that this battle is not unfolding according to any plan he has been given. And as he looks out once more toward the shoreline, seeing not a broken assault, but an ever-growing presence pushing steadily forward, he begins to understand that the enemy is not just attacking the beach, but reshaping the entire battlefield, in a way that no amount of preparation can fully contain, and that the confidence he carried into this day is being replaced by something far more uncertain as the hours continue to pass, and the tide of war moves inexorably in a direction he can no longer ignore, because the tide that had once seemed like a barrier now becomes a conveyor of endless reinforcements, each wave bringing more men, more equipment, and more proof that this is not a single assault to be repelled, but the beginning of something far larger and far more relentless. By midday, the illusion of containment has begun to collapse across the entire front, and while isolated strongpoints continue to fight with determination, the broader defensive network is unraveling in ways that cannot be easily repaired. Communication lines that once connected bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts are severed or unreliable, forcing individual units to operate in isolation, each commander making decisions based on incomplete information and a rapidly changing battlefield. In the rear areas, the situation is even more chaotic, as reports of airborne troops continue to circulate, some accurate and others wildly exaggerated, creating a sense that the enemy is everywhere at once. German units attempting to reposition find themselves hesitant, unsure whether they are moving toward the main threat or into an ambush, and this hesitation proves just as damaging as any direct attack. For those at the front, however, the reality is brutally clear. So's machine gun continues to fire, but the rhythm has changed. No longer the controlled burst of a planned defense, but a desperate effort to keep pace with an enemy that does not seem to diminish. The barrel, already worn from hours of use, begins to warp under the heat, affecting accuracy, forcing him to adjust constantly just to maintain effectiveness. Around him, the bunker is littered with spent casings, the metallic debris forming a chaotic landscape that reflects the intensity of the battle. At some point, the act of firing becomes less about targeting individual soldiers and more about holding back a mass, an indistinct flow of movement that continues regardless of losses. And this shift marks a critical psychological turning point. Because when an enemy can absorb casualties without slowing, when each loss is immediately replaced by another advance, the very concept of victory begins to lose its meaning. Elsewhere along Omaha Beach, similar scenes unfold, with German defenders reporting that their firepower, though still deadly, is no longer decisive. The carefully calculated interlocking fields of fire remain operational in many sectors, but they are being overwhelmed not by tactical brilliance, but by sheer volume. Every position that continues to resist becomes a focal point for concentrated Allied fire, as naval guns and aircraft are directed with increasing precision to suppress or destroy strongholds that threaten the advance. The coordination of this response is something the German defenders had not fully anticipated, because it reflects a level of communication and integration that goes beyond traditional battlefield tactics. Naval observers, forward air controllers, and ground units operate as parts of a single system, identifying targets and directing fire with an efficiency that amplifies the already overwhelming material advantage. For the German artillery batteries positioned behind the beaches, the situation becomes increasingly dire. Ammunition stocks, calculated for a sustained but limited engagement, are being depleted at an unsustainable rate, and attempts to conserve shells by reducing fire only serve to weaken the overall defense. Some batteries are forced to cease firing altogether, not because they have been destroyed, but because they simply have nothing left to fire. This shortage reveals a deeper flaw in the defensive planning, one that had been masked by confidence in the strength of the Atlantic Wall. The assumption had always been that the initial assault would be decisive, that the enemy would either succeed quickly or fail entirely. and so the logistics of prolonged high-intensity combat had not been fully addressed. Now, as the battle extends far beyond those initial expectations, the limitations of that approach become painfully clear. Meanwhile, the Allied forces continue to build momentum. Engineers work under fire to clear obstacles from the beaches, using explosives and specialized equipment to open paths through the defenses. And once those paths are established, the flow of vehicles and heavy weapons begins in earnest. Tanks, artillery, and supply trucks move inland, transforming what had been a vulnerable landing force into a growing and increasingly resilient presence. For the German defenders, watching this transformation, the effect is deeply unsettling because it signals that the window for repelling the invasion is closing rapidly. The moment when concentrated firepower might have forced the enemy back into the sea is passing, replaced by a new reality in which the Allies are establishing a foothold that will only become stronger with time. So senses this shift, even if he cannot fully articulate it, because the targets he engages are no longer just infantry struggling across open ground, but organized units advancing with support, using cover, coordinating movements, adapting to the conditions of the battlefield in ways that suggest preparation for exactly this scenario. The battle is evolving, and the defenders are being forced to react rather than dictate its course. As the afternoon wears on, exhaustion begins to take its toll, not just physically but mentally, as the constant stress and intensity erode the clarity of thought needed to maintain effective resistance. The initial confidence that had sustained the defenders is replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty, a recognition that the situation is not unfolding as expected, and that the outcome is far from assured. In some sectors, this uncertainty turns into withdrawal as isolated units cut off from support and facing overwhelming pressure abandon their positions in an attempt to regroup further inland. In others, it manifests as stubborn resistance, a determination to hold ground at all costs, even as the broader strategic picture deteriorates. But regardless of the individual responses, the overall trend is unmistakable. The line is bending. Not breaking outright, not yet, but yielding under the weight of a force that continues to apply pressure at every point, exploiting weaknesses, reinforcing success, and maintaining a level of intensity that the defenders cannot match indefinitely. By late afternoon, the German High Command begins to grasp the full extent of the situation, as fragmented reports coalesce into a clearer picture of multiple beachheads established along the Normandy coast, each one growing in strength, each one representing a breach in the defensive system that had been considered unassailable. Orders are issued to commit reserves, to launch counterattacks, to contain and then eliminate the enemy footholds. But the execution of these orders is hampered by the same factors that have plagued the defense from the beginning. Communication delays, uncertainty about enemy positions, and the constant threat of Allied air power all combine to slow the response, turning what should be rapid and decisive movements into hesitant and fragmented efforts. When elements of the 21st Panzer Division finally begin to move toward the front, they do so under constant observation. Their columns visible from the air, their progress tracked and targeted by Allied aircraft that strike with precision and frequency. Vehicles are destroyed, roads are blocked, and the cohesion of the advancing units begins to break down even before they reach the battlefield. For the soldiers involved, this experience is deeply disorienting, because it challenges the fundamental expectation that movement behind the lines should offer some degree of safety. Instead, they find themselves under attack at every stage, their ability to maneuver severely restricted by an enemy that seems to control not just the battlefield, but the entire operational environment. Back at the coast, the fighting continues with relentless intensity, but the character of the engagement is changing. Where once the defenders held clear positional advantages, they now find themselves increasingly on the defensive in a more fluid sense, responding to penetrations, attempting to plug gaps, and dealing with threats that emerge in unexpected places. So's bunker, once a dominant position overlooking a controlled sector of the beach, becomes one point among many in a fragmented and shifting line. The targets he engages are closer now, more dispersed and more difficult to track, as small groups of Allied soldiers move inland, using terrain and cover to reduce their exposure. The sense of control that had defined the early hours of the battle is gone, replaced by a constant need to adapt, to respond, to survive. At some point, the ammunition supply within the bunker begins to run critically low, and the realization that the weapon cannot continue indefinitely forces a new kind of calculation, one that had not been part of the original plan. Every burst must be measured, every shot considered. not just for its immediate effect, but for the necessity of conserving what remains. This change introduces a new layer of pressure, because it means accepting that the ability to fight effectively is finite, that there will come a moment when the gun falls silent not by choice, but by necessity, and that beyond that moment lies an unknown outcome. As evening approaches, the battlefield is transformed by the fading light. Shadows stretching across the sand, the noise of combat gradually shifting as some areas quiet while others remain active, and the defenders who are still able to fight begin to take stock of their situation. What they see is not a defeated enemy retreating to the sea, but a firmly established presence. A network of positions connected and supported, a foothold that has survived the most intense phase of the battle and is now poised to expand further inland. For So, the realization is deeply unsettling because it contradicts everything he had been told, everything he had believed about how this day would unfold. The invasion was supposed to be stopped at the water's edge, the attackers thrown back before they could gain a foothold. And yet here they are, not just present, but advancing. The weight of that realization begins to settle in as the adrenaline of combat fades, replaced by a growing awareness of the larger implications. And as he looks out over the battlefield, now marked by wreckage and movement rather than empty sea, he begins to understand that this is not the end of a failed assault, but the beginning of something that will continue beyond this day, beyond this beach and into the very heart of the war itself. And as darkness slowly returns to the channel, bringing with it a brief and uneasy lull, the German defenders who remain find themselves facing a reality that is far more difficult to confront than any enemy soldier. The knowledge that despite everything they have done, despite the firepower they have unleashed and the losses they have inflicted, the invasion has not been stopped. And that the next phase of the battle is already taking shape just beyond the limits of what they can see, as reinforcements continue to arrive and the fragile foothold of the morning begins to transform into something far more permanent. And with that transformation comes a shift that is felt not just in positions on a map, but in the minds of the men still holding their ground. Because the battle they are fighting is no longer about preventing a landing, but about surviving the consequences of one that has already succeeded. Through the night, the illusion of rest never truly arrives, because even in darkness the war does not pause. It simply changes form. And for German units attempting to regroup, the hours after sunset become some of the most dangerous of the entire day. Movement, which might once have offered concealment, now invites destruction as allied. Forces illuminate the countryside with flares that drift slowly downward, turning night into an eerie half-light where every silhouette becomes a target. Columns attempting to advance are caught in these sudden artificial dawns, exposed and vulnerable, and then the fire begins. Artillery from offshore ships that strike with unnerving accuracy as if guided by unseen observers, combined with land-based guns that have already been brought ashore and integrated into the expanding Allied network. The sense that the enemy can see everything, can reach everywhere, begins to take hold, and it erodes the confidence of even the most experienced soldiers. Hans von Luck's forces, finally committed to action, experience this reality firsthand as they attempt to move toward the British positions near Sword Beach. The advance begins with determination, engines low, troops alert, but it quickly devolves into chaos as flares ignite overhead and the first shells land among them. Vehicles are hit, formations disrupted, and the cohesion necessary for an effective counterattack is shattered almost immediately. Men who had expected to engage in a direct confrontation instead find themselves under relentless bombardment without ever seeing the enemy. And this unseen pressure creates a different kind of fear. One that is harder to resist because it offers no clear target, no opportunity for retaliation. By the time the remnants of these units pull back, the cost has been severe. Not just in material losses, but in morale, because the belief that they could still influence the battle through decisive action has been deeply shaken. Elsewhere, the scattered German formations struggle to make sense of their situation, as reports continue to conflict and communication remains unreliable. Some commanders still believe that a concentrated effort might drive the Allies back, that the footholds are fragile and can be broken with sufficient force, while others begin to recognize that the window for such an outcome has already closed. In the bunkers along the coast, those who remain face a quieter but equally profound realization. So, exhausted and surrounded by the remnants of his ammunition supply, sits in a silence that feels almost unnatural after the hours of continuous fire, and as the noise of the battlefield shifts to distant echoes, he becomes aware of something he has not allowed himself to consider until now. The gun that had defined his role in the battle, that had given him a sense of control and purpose, is no longer the deciding factor, because the enemy it was meant to stop is no longer confined to the open beach below. They are inland. That single fact changes everything, because it means that the carefully prepared defenses, the arcs of fire, the overlapping positions, all of it was designed for a moment that has already passed, and what remains is a structure built for a battle that no longer exists in its original form. As dawn approaches on June 7th, the full extent of the shift becomes visible. The beaches, once contested ground, now serve as logistical hubs, crowded not with struggling assault waves, but with organized activity, vehicles unloading, supplies being distributed, units forming and moving with purpose. The transformation is so rapid and so complete that it reinforces the growing understanding among German observers that they are not facing a temporary incursion, but a sustained campaign. Every hour brings more ships, more men, more equipment, and the scale of it begins to take on a rhythm, a predictable and unstoppable flow that contrasts sharply with the increasingly strained and fragmented German efforts to respond. Attempts to bring reinforcements into Normandy reveal just how much the balance of power has shifted. Units moving from deeper within France find themselves under constant attack, not just at key points, but along entire routes, as Allied aircraft patrol the skies with near impunity. Bridges are destroyed, roads cratered, convoys scattered, and the journey to the front becomes a prolonged ordeal that saps strength and cohesion long before any engagement with ground forces. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, ordered to move north, becomes a stark example of this new reality. What should have been a rapid redeployment turns into a drawn-out struggle against an enemy that controls the air and can strike at will. Vehicles are lost, not in battle, but en route, destroyed by fighter bombers that appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly, leaving behind burning wreckage and disrupted formations. For the soldiers experiencing this, it becomes clear that the battlefield is no longer confined to the immediate vicinity of the front lines, but extends across the entire region, a continuous zone of danger where movement itself is contested. Meanwhile, the Allied forces continue to consolidate their position with remarkable efficiency. Engineers complete the clearing of beach obstacles, allowing for the steady flow of heavy equipment, while the construction of artificial harbors begins to take shape. An innovation that ensures the sustained delivery of supplies regardless of the condition of existing ports. This level of preparation, this ability to create infrastructure almost as quickly as territory is secured, highlights a fundamental difference in approach, one that places as much emphasis on logistics as on combat. For German commanders observing these developments, the implications are impossible to ignore. The invasion is not just holding, it is expanding, and the resources being brought to bear suggest that it will continue to do so at an accelerating pace. The idea of containing the Allies within a limited area becomes increasingly unrealistic, replaced by the more immediate concern of how to slow an advance that seems inevitable. On the ground, the fighting continues, but it takes on a different character, shifting from the intense and concentrated violence of the initial landings to a more dispersed and fluid series of engagements as Allied units push inland and German forces attempt to establish new defensive lines. So, now removed from the immediate focus of the beach, becomes part of this transition, moving from a fixed position to a more uncertain role within a retreating and reorganizing force. The clarity of purpose that had defined his actions the day before is gone, replaced by a constant need to adapt to changing circumstances, to respond to orders that are often delayed or unclear, to navigate a battlefield that no longer conforms to any predictable pattern. As days pass, the cumulative effect of these changes begins to weigh heavily on the German forces. Losses mount, not just in terms of men and equipment, but in cohesion and confidence, and the disparity between what they can deploy and what the Allies continue to bring forward becomes increasingly stark. Where German units struggle to replace even minor losses, Allied formations are reinforced continuously, maintaining strength and momentum. The fall of key positions further deepens the sense of crisis. Carentan, a critical junction connecting the American beachheads, becomes the focus of intense fighting, and when it eventually falls, it marks a significant step in the consolidation of Allied control. The link between Utah and Omaha is established, creating a unified front that is far more difficult to challenge than isolated footholds. For German soldiers, this development carries both tactical and psychological weight, because it demonstrates that the Allies are not only capable of landing and holding ground, but of coordinating their advances in a way that strengthens their overall position. Efforts to counterattack continue, but they are increasingly constrained by the same factors that have defined the battle from the beginning. Limited resources, disrupted communication, and the constant threat from the air all combine to reduce the effectiveness of these operations, turning what might have been decisive engagements into costly and inconclusive actions. Even moments of success fail to alter the broader trajectory. When individual units achieve local victories, destroying enemy armor or pushing back advancing forces, the impact is often temporary, because the Allies are able to absorb these setbacks and respond with overwhelming force. The replacement of lost equipment and personnel happens with a speed and scale that the German forces cannot match, reinforcing the sense that they are engaged in a struggle where tactical skill alone is insufficient. As the campaign continues into the following weeks, this imbalance becomes even more pronounced. The Allied buildup accelerates, transforming the Normandy region into a vast operational base, while German forces find themselves increasingly stretched, their ability to mount effective resistance diminishing with each passing day. The introduction of large-scale operations designed to break through the remaining defenses brings with it a level of firepower that further erodes any hope of stabilizing the front. For those on the receiving end, the experience is overwhelming. Bombardments that last for hours, saturating entire Manhattan with explosives, leave little opportunity for organized resistance, and the psychological impact of such sustained pressure is profound. Soldiers who had endured the initial shock of D-Day now face a different kind of strain, one that comes from the relentless nature of the conflict. The constant awareness that the enemy possesses not just superior numbers, but an almost limitless capacity to continue the fight. In this environment, the concept of victory becomes increasingly abstract. What does it mean to win a battle when the enemy can simply replace losses and continue advancing, when every defensive line is temporary, every position vulnerable to being outflanked or overwhelmed? These questions, once theoretical, become immediate and unavoidable, shaping the thoughts and actions of those who remain on the front lines. And as the pressure continues to build, as the Allied forces prepare for the next phase of their advance, the German soldiers who have survived this far begin to sense that they are not just fighting a battle, but witnessing the unraveling of something much larger. A realization that settles in gradually, but carries with it a weight that is impossible to ignore, because it suggests that what began on the beaches of Normandy is not simply a turning point in a campaign, but the beginning of the end for everything they have been fighting to defend. Because what unfolds in the weeks that follow strips away any remaining illusion that this is a contest that can still be reversed, and instead reveals a grinding, systematic collapse, driven not by a single decisive blow, but by the relentless accumulation of pressure that no defense can withstand indefinitely. By mid-June, the landscape of Normandy itself begins to change under the weight of constant movement and destruction, fields churned into mud by tanks and artillery, villages reduced to rubble, roads scarred by craters that force vehicles into narrow, predictable routes where they become easy targets for aircraft circling overhead. Every attempt to establish a stable defensive line is disrupted before it can fully take shape, as Allied forces probe continuously, identifying weak points and exploiting them with a combination of firepower and maneuver that keeps the Germans off balance. For the men on the ground, the experience becomes one of constant displacement, never holding a position long enough to feel secure, always aware that the enemy possesses the initiative and can choose where and when to strike. Orders arrive to hold, then to withdraw, then to counterattack, often within the span of a single day. And the lack of consistency begins to erode confidence in the larger command structure. So, now part of a fragmented unit moving between temporary positions, finds that the war has become something entirely different from what he experienced on the morning of June 6th. The clarity of defending a fixed point has been replaced by a sense of drift, a continuous retreat punctuated by brief and violent engagements that achieve little beyond delaying the inevitable. The weapon he once relied on so heavily is still with him, but it no longer defines the battle because the scale has expanded beyond the reach of any single soldier or position. As the Allies push deeper inland, their logistical superiority becomes even more apparent, not just in the quantity of supplies, but in the organization with which they are distributed. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical support all flow forward in a steady stream, ensuring that advancing units maintain their effectiveness even as the distance from the beaches increases. This level of sustainment allows for operations that would have been impossible under more limited conditions, enabling continuous pressure without the pauses that might otherwise give the defenders time to recover. In contrast, German supply lines become increasingly strained, not only because of the distance involved, but because of the constant disruption caused by Allied air attacks and resistance activity. Trains are derailed, convoys ambushed, and critical resources fail to reach the front in sufficient quantities. Units that manage to hold their positions often do so with dwindling ammunition and limited support, their ability to continue fighting dependent on circumstances that grow more unfavorable with each passing day. The disparity is not lost on the soldiers themselves. They see the difference in equipment, in mobility, in the sheer volume of material being brought to bear against them, and it begins to shape their perception of the conflict in ways that go beyond immediate tactical concerns. What they are facing is not just an enemy army, but an entire system designed to sustain and amplify military power on a scale they cannot match. Moments of intense combat continue to occur, and in these moments, the skill and determination of individual German soldiers are still evident. Counterattacks are launched, defensive stands are made, and in some cases, temporary successes are achieved. But these efforts increasingly feel disconnected from the overall trajectory of the campaign. Each gain is fleeting, each success overshadowed by the larger movement of the front, which continues to shift steadily in favor of the Allies. The capture of Cherbourg at the end of June serves as a clear indicator of this trend. The port, heavily fortified and expected to hold for an extended period, falls far more quickly than anticipated, providing the Allies with a critical logistical asset that further strengthens their position. For German commanders, this loss is not just a tactical setback, but a strategic blow, as it removes one of the few remaining obstacles to the sustained flow of supplies into Normandy. By early July, the situation has deteriorated to the point where even the most optimistic assessments struggle to identify a viable path forward. Reinforcements continue to arrive, but they are insufficient to offset the losses being incurred, and the quality of these units varies widely, with some lacking the training and experience needed to operate effectively under the conditions they encounter. The cumulative effect is a gradual weakening of the overall force, a thinning of the line that makes it increasingly vulnerable to concentrated attacks. It is in this context that Operation Cobra is launched, and when it begins, it does so with a level of intensity that surpasses even the initial landings. The bombardment that precedes the ground assault is unlike anything the German forces have experienced, a concentrated application of air power that saturates a relatively narrow area with an overwhelming volume of explosives. The ground shakes continuously, the air filled with dust and debris, and the ability to maintain cohesion under such conditions becomes nearly impossible. For those caught within the target zone, the experience is disorienting and devastating, as positions are obliterated and units fragmented before the ground attack even begins. Survivors emerge from the bombardment not as organized formations, but as scattered individuals, their capacity to resist severely diminished. When the Allied forces advance, they encounter opposition, but it lacks the coordination and strength that might have slowed their progress under different circumstances. Breakthroughs are achieved, lines are penetrated, and once the initial rupture occurs, it expands rapidly as mobile units exploit the gaps and push deeper into the German rear. The pace of the advance accelerates, transforming the character of the campaign once again, from a grinding battle of attrition into a more fluid and dynamic operation where speed and momentum play a critical role. German units attempt to respond, to contain the breakthrough, to re-establish a coherent defensive line, but the conditions make such efforts increasingly difficult. Communication remains unreliable. Movement is still constrained by air attacks, and the pressure from advancing Allied forces leaves little time to organize an effective response. For So and others like him, the experience becomes one of continuous retreat, moving from one position to another, often under fire, with little sense of where the next line will be drawn or how long it will hold. The landscape they pass through bears the marks of the campaign: destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the constant presence of aircraft overhead, serving as a reminder that there is no safe place to regroup. As July turns to August, the situation reaches a critical point with the encirclement of German forces in what becomes known as the Falaise Pocket. The convergence of Allied forces from multiple directions creates a trap that closes steadily, compressing the remaining German units into an increasingly confined area where escape becomes more difficult with each passing day. The intensity of the fighting within the pocket is extreme, as units attempt to break out while under constant attack from ground forces and aircraft. The roads become scenes of devastation, clogged with vehicles and debris as columns attempt to move through narrow corridors that are repeatedly targeted by airstrikes. The destruction is so extensive that movement itself becomes hazardous, with wreckage blocking routes and forcing vehicles into exposed positions where they can be easily engaged. For those caught within the pocket, the sense of desperation is palpable as the realization sets in that the situation is rapidly becoming untenable. Some units manage to escape, slipping through gaps before they close completely, but many are unable to do so, either because they lack the mobility or because the timing is not in their favor. The result is a massive loss of men and equipment, a blow from which the German forces in the West will not recover. So, among the survivors, who manage to avoid capture or death, emerges from this phase of the campaign with a perspective that has been fundamentally altered. The war he entered with confidence and belief in eventual victory has been replaced by a stark understanding of its realities, shaped by experiences that have stripped away the narratives that once gave it meaning. The scale of the Allied effort, the coordination, the resources, all of it has demonstrated that the conflict is being fought on terms that Germany cannot match. And, as the remnants of the German forces retreat toward the east, leaving behind the shattered landscape of Normandy, the implications of what has occurred begin to settle in more fully, not just as a military defeat, but as a turning point that signals the broader trajectory of the war, a trajectory that now seems increasingly inevitable as the balance of power continues to shift. And in that retreat, there is no sense of regrouping for a renewed defense that might restore the balance, only a growing awareness that what has been lost in Normandy cannot be regained, because it was never just territory or equipment or even entire formations, but the last realistic chance to stop the Western Allies before they broke into the heart of occupied Europe. The road east becomes a long corridor of reflection for those who survive it, lined not only with the wreckage of vehicles and abandoned weapons, but with the quiet realization that the war has changed in a way that cannot be undone. For months, even years, German soldiers had fought with the belief that setbacks could be reversed, that a decisive counterstroke might still alter the outcome, that somewhere ahead there would be a moment when the tide would turn back in their favor. Normandy erases that belief, because what they have witnessed is not just defeat, but a demonstration of a kind of warfare that renders their own strengths insufficient. Courage is still present, discipline remains, and in countless engagements, individual units fight with determination and skill, but these qualities exist within a framework that has been overtaken by something larger, something more powerful, something that operates with a scale and consistency that cannot be matched by isolated acts of bravery. For so, the machine gunner who began June 6th with quiet confidence, the memory of that day does not fade into abstraction but remains vivid, anchored in the physical reality of what he experienced. The weight of the weapon in his hands, the endless stream of targets moving through the surf, the growing pile of spent casings around him, and then the moment when it became clear that none of it was enough. That no matter how many rounds he fired, no matter how many times he forced the enemy down, they continued to come. That realization becomes the defining truth of Normandy. Not that the German defenders failed to fight, but that they were fighting a battle whose outcome had already been shaped by forces far beyond the immediate field of combat. The factories across the Atlantic, the shipyards, the training grounds, the coordination of air, land, and sea, all of it converging on a single point and overwhelming everything placed in its path. And as the weeks turn into months and the war continues to move toward its conclusion, that truth spreads beyond the soldiers who stood on those beaches, becoming part of the broader understanding of what the conflict has become. A war not decided by moments alone, but by the ability to sustain those moments, to repeat them, to reinforce them, to ensure that every loss is temporary and every advance builds upon the last. For the German High Command, the reports from Normandy carry a tone that is difficult to reconcile with the rhetoric that had defined the war up to that point. The language shifts, becoming more cautious, more measured, reflecting an awareness that the situation is no longer one of managing fronts, but of confronting an enemy whose advantages are structural and enduring. Even among those who continue to believe in eventual victory, there is a recognition that the path to it has narrowed to the point of near impossibility. For others, particularly those who have seen Normandy firsthand, the conclusion is already clear, even if it is not yet spoken openly. The war, as they had understood it, is lost, And yet the fighting continues because it must, because orders are still given and followed, because the machinery of war does not stop simply because its outcome becomes apparent. But beneath that continuation lies a different kind of awareness, one that shapes how the remaining battles are fought and how they are remembered. The beaches of Normandy, once seen as the place where the invasion would be stopped, become instead a symbol of transition, the point at which the balance shifted, irreversibly, where the last illusions of parity were stripped away and replaced by a stark and undeniable reality. For the Allied soldiers who landed there, it is remembered as the beginning of liberation, a hard-won foothold that opened the path into occupied Europe. For the German defenders, it is remembered as something else entirely, a moment of revelation. A day when everything they had been told collided with everything they experienced, and the difference between the two could no longer be ignored. In the years after the war, those who survived would speak about Normandy, not just in terms of tactics or movements or outcomes, but in terms of what it felt like to stand against something so vast that it defied comprehension. They would describe the endless ships, the constant aircraft, the unbroken flow of men and material, and the sense that they were witnessing not just an army, but an entire system of war operating at full capacity. Some would try to quantify it, to assign numbers to the experience, to measure the scale in terms of divisions and tonnage and sorties. But even those numbers would fall short of capturing the full impact, because what they had faced was not just large. It was continuous. It did not stop, it did not falter, it did not allow for recovery. And that continuity is what ultimately defined the outcome. So would carry that understanding with him long after the war ended, his memory shaped not only by the violence of the day, but by the clarity it brought, a clarity that cut through the narratives and revealed the underlying truth of the conflict he had been part of. That truth was not comforting. It did not offer justification or redemption, only an explanation. A way of understanding how a battle that had been prepared for so carefully could still end in such decisive failure. And in that understanding lies the lasting significance of D-Day from the German perspective. It was not just the beginning of the end in a military sense, but the moment when the nature of the war itself became undeniable, when the outcome was no longer a matter of possibility, but of time. The Atlantic Wall, with all its concrete and steel, had not been weak. The soldiers who manned it had not lacked courage. The plans had not been without logic. But all of it had been built on assumptions that no longer applied, on a vision of warfare that had already been surpassed by the reality unfolding across the Channel. And when that reality arrived on the shores of Normandy, it did not simply break through the defenses, it rendered them irrelevant. So when we look back on June 6, 1944, it is easy to focus on the scale of the invasion, the bravery of those who landed, the dramatic images of ships and soldiers and battle. But there is another side to that story, one that unfolds in the bunkers and behind the gun sights, in the thoughts of those who watched it happen and realized piece by piece that they were witnessing something that could not be stopped. A moment when war itself changed. A moment when the outcome of a global conflict moved from uncertainty to inevitability. And a moment that reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who advance, but also by those who stand and see, often before anyone else, that the tide has already turned. If you found this perspective valuable and want to explore more deeply human, historically grounded stories from World War II, consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Because these stories are not just about the past. They are about understanding how moments like this reshape the world and the people within it, and why even now, decades later, the echoes of Normandy still matter.